I'm a preacher, basically. Preachers have a habit of opening whatever they have to say with a Bible text just to persuade you that they're not saying it, but it comes with authority. So here's my Bible text for this morning. It's from the 4th Psalm. Many there be that say, who will show us any good? And let me just spell out two simple theses from this. And the first thesis is that the good must be shown us. The good is reality. The good is reality as it's offered to us to see and to know and to participate in. We may search for truth, we may discover facts, but the good can only be given. And until it is given, it is waited for, looked for, searched for as a reality that supervenes on what we have been able to know and do on our own account. Second thesis, there is an event in which the good is shown. Who will show us any good? There is a who, an agent, there is a will, a time and a moment. Good may be everywhere in the world and at all times, because the God who made the world is good and does good. But the good is not shown us equally everywhere and at all times. It's shown us by a definite person at a definite point in time. The testimony of prophets and apostles points to that event. God shows it. God shows us good, and he does so in raising Jesus Christ from the dead. Now, our concern today is with how the Christian mind may bring that testimony to bear on the infinitely wide search for knowledge in the sciences. Now, may we agree as a terminological matter that we will use the term science in the broad European way. That is to say, including all structured disciplines for acquiring knowledge. Our English habit of using science for primarily observational disciplines, as distinct from philological scholarship, as we would call it, and theoretical thought or speculation, overlooks the degree, I think, to which all fields of study make use in some measure of all these intellectual functions as they proceed. The scientist is nowhere on the basis of observation alone if he has no speculative or theoretical powers, for example. So can science, in this broad sense in which all academic work is a science of one kind or another, can science recognize the good? We're often encouraged to think that a scientist had better not think in terms of the good. Goods are supposed to be practical objects, having to do with the exploitation of knowledge, perhaps, but not having to do with the knowledge itself. Observation of things is an ascetic task from which the observer's interests ought to be strained out in order that the phenomenon can be allowed to appear objectively. And there is obvious truth in that. To take a very simple and obvious example. I recently read a work of legal history about the great judgment of Lord Mansfield in 1772, which prevented the repossession of escaped slaves on British soil, a very dramatic legal moment in our history. The author of the book wanted to cheer, and of course, so did I. But cheering implies booing, and the author's booing drowned out his analysis of the rather complicated legal and social questions that the actors in 1772 actually faced. Secretly, though he wouldn't put it like this, secretly the author thought the matter should have been much more straightforward for them than they actually found it to be in life. So I came away from this book not understanding those actors entirely. And much worse, so did the author come away not understanding. He lacked, as we commonly say, the distance on his material that would have allowed him to adjust his 21st century expectations to see their actual conditions better, and so to understand their achievement better. Yet, having said that, this distance and standing back is only a provisional suspension of interest. In the end, if the work has been worthwhile and the distance has been well judged, we will end up more interested in our subject than we began. We do need to justify to ourselves, to God, to other people, our pursuit of whatever knowledge it is we pursue. Life cannot be lived without self-examination, Socrates said, and that's true above all, I think, of the academic life. Why does this trivial piece of knowledge matter? What does it contribute to? These are questions to which, if we have no answers in our work, we shall quickly turn away from the university and go to make money in the city. To ask why it matters is to ask what good it is. And then the question returns, how can we recognize it as a good? Knowledge is an abstract concept and may sometimes be of an abstract thing. There may be a knowledge of value-free objects, such as the solution to a complex equation. But knowing is a concrete concept of human engagement. Knowing is part of human life and existence, and there can be no value-free knowing. Even in pursuing the knowledge of God, we find the same dynamic that I just described of suspending interest and confirming it. Theologians know all about this, driven by their initial love of God to want to know God better. They find, and it can become quite a regular experience, they find their enthusiasm suddenly brought to a halt. Perhaps by something they can't understand. Perhaps by some evil that has befallen them, befallen those they love. They find they have to adjust their ideas and their perspectives and their assumptions and start looking again. But their love has not been abandoned in that process. Their convictions have not been torn up. They have been simply forced to understand them much better. But if knowing and loving God is in that respect a little bit like knowing and loving particle physics, Egyptology, or whatever our intellectual focus may be. There's a reason why it is. And that is that all our desires to know things about the world are really tributary streams to that first and most important desire to know the good of God himself, the giver of reality to us and to all things, who made the world and governs it. So we return to our first thesis. The good must be shown. Which is why that when the psalmist has asked, who will show us any good, he moves straight into a prayer. O Lord, lift thou up the light of thy countenance upon us. The desire to know some good can be satisfied only as the good shows itself, or rather, as he shows himself. And he does so in the strength of his own light, the light of thy countenance, which is the truth and the meaning that we seek in our field of inquiry. For any field of knowledge, however worldly it may become transparent to the light of God's presence to the world. God, who is true being in himself, offers us himself to enjoy as the true good, and with himself the world of created reality to enjoy as it becomes to us transparent to his light. Its reality is offered to us to engage with cognitively, to engage with practically, and so to grasp it as good in the light of his countenance. For the good is a communicated reality, a reality shared with us. Now, when we come to know anything, it must be a bilateral engagement. On the one hand, we come to know something because we seek, we do our research, we look it up, we find it out, we take observations. But seeking always comes second. Governing the seeking, there is always a question that is somehow there before us. We recognize it as being there, a question to be answered. The object comes to be known by us because it has elicited a search from us. It's up to us to write the research proposal, but behind any good research proposal, there must lie an object waiting to be known. If we're not aware of that, then the assessor of the proposal certainly is. The assessor is asking, has the applicant found a good question here? And a research proposal should read a little bit like a cry of Eureka. I found it. But at the same time, as something found, it should also read like a cry of bewilderment. But I don't know what it is that I have found. Here is a something. It's got to be explored. It's got to be gone into. God has illuminated something for us with the light of his countenance through his creation. He has illuminated it through his government of history, or his revealed word, by one means or another. He has set it before us to get to know it in the way that it really demands to be known. Another psalm, Psalm 138 this time, puts all this in a very concise way. For you, the psalmist says to God, you have magnified above all things your name and your word. God's name, the secret of his being, the secret behind all being that makes it interesting, important, commanding to us. God's word, the way he reaches out to us with his secret, invites us to participate in his thoughts and his works, cognitively and practically to give ourselves in worship to what he has done. And in that word, we can discern the shape of every object that we may in our lives set out to explore and describe and admire. So then, let's return to our second thesis. The answer to the question, who will show us good, implies a definite where and when. It is where God has let the light of his countenance shine, where he has made his presence known. But here we have to speak of a twofold showing. God has made his presence known potentially universally in an act of creation from which nothing was lacking. God has given being to all that we find before us, and it stands there inviting our interest, calling us, asking us to investigate it. He has also allowed that being to unfold in time so that its potential may appear as actual. Yet there's something in all this that is not concluded as it stands. I don't know whether you know that remarkable line in Gerald Manley Hopkins' poem about harvest, where he says, of all the things he sees in the harvest field, these things were here, and but the beholder wanting. The creation is given, but the gift of knowledge of the Creator is yet to follow, for it requires someone to be capable of knowing it. For our part, we tend to take the beholder, the scientist, the investigator, the historian, whatever, for granted. After all, we think to ourselves, here we are. And being here, here is our research grant. What's stopping us? All we need to think about is the what. All we need are a few data to get to work. But whatever can be known sets terms for that which can know it. The bat will never know colour. The tree will never know motion. Ambulation, at any rate. Trees wave, but they don't march. And the creation of God will be known only by those attuned to God's purposes in creating. And any knowledge that falls short of that will be a partial, fragmentary knowledge, and to the extent that it's taken for knowledge of the whole, it will be diabolically false. So, God, having shown the good he has purposed universally in creation, has revealed to us the good of his purpose in a second way, in history, through the giving of the Son of Man, the one who is fit to appear before him and be recognized by him, because he can offer him the worship and the recognition due to his being and to his work. Let me illustrate this point from two very beautiful scriptural texts to which I found myself constantly returning for nourishment over 4 decades and upwards. In the 4th chapter of the Apocalypse, the Revelation of John, the last book of the New Testament, the scene in heaven opens with a wonderful view of creation spread out before the throne of God. every kind of being is in its proper place. And every kind of being in its place offers its hymn of praise to the Creator. And everything seems to be perfectly clear. And then John sees something that is not clear. In the right hand of God on the throne, there is a scroll, sealed 7 times, as he tells us. And as we read on, we shall learn that this is the scroll of history, of unfolding time, and especially time seen as the history of war. And John bursts into tears. Why? Because the beauty and the wonder of all creation has ultimately been left valueless to him if there is no corresponding meaning offered to what is becoming of it. But this is the comfort that he is then given. Weep no more. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah has conquered, so that he can open the scroll. And as he looks to see the little lion, he sees, of course, a lamb slain, a sacrificial lamb standing before the throne of God, to whom the scroll of history is given to open. And in the history of the drama of the slain and risen sacrifice of Christ, the meaning of all events is focused, and the meaning of all creation is vindicated. That is what we're being told in that fascinating and important drama in the book. Less pictorially, more propositionally, the Apostle to the Hebrews takes us on what is more or less the same journey. He starts from creation and quotes the 8th Psalm, which was read to us at the beginning of this morning, about the whole of creation being wholly subject to man's dominion. And he then declares, startlingly, that this is in fact contradicted by our present experience. We do not yet see everything subject to him, he says, then goes on, but we see Jesus, humbled for a while below the angels in his mortal suffering, crowned with glory and honor. An event at the center of history, focused in one decisive man at one decisive moment, reveals to us the created world and the human place in it. The man in whom the word of God dwelt among us offers us a knowledge perfected by obedience, extending to the very heart of our own incapacity to know and to love God adequately. His suffering and triumph becomes the calling of what we are to be and the invitation of a world that may be known as God's world. Vindicated in his resurrection, he is the promise of the completion of God's purpose for mankind, and with mankind for the whole world of which mankind is a participant. So here I think we see how a grasp of this moment in history, the Christ moment, is for us an existential condition of any science as a human undertaking. It's a condition for seeking a knowledge of the world without fear of disenchantment and despair. A third text of scripture that bears on this very same point, I think, is that amazingly profound saying at the beginning of Hebrews 11 about faith. Faith is what gives substance to things hoped for and demonstrates unseen realities. By faith, we grasp the universe as framed by the divine word, so that evidential appearances have grounds beyond our observation. Notice how the apostle has divided up the field of faith into two here: things hoped for and things unseen. Faith means seeing the deeper meaning of the phenomena of history, things hoped for. And it means seeing the deeper meaning of the phenomena of nature, things unseen. It is the condition for thinking together a science of nature and a science of history. Nature and history. We come back to that duality constantly, and I was wondering earlier how, and I don't know the answer to this, how it corresponds to Jared Mickelson's polarity of the poets and the philosophers. I think it does, but we would have to explore it a little bit. Our concrete sciences, the ones we earn our money for, tend to focus on one or another of those two poles, either on the natural pole or on the historical pole. We commonly distinguish between natural science and what we call the humanities, and whether those are good names for the two focuses, I doubt very much, but the principle of division is clear enough. They offer us, on one hand, a knowledge of created nature and its order, and on the other, a knowledge of what has befallen to that created order in the course of time. The one kind of science seeks its point of rest, as it were, in regularities and universals. The other seeks its rest in narrative tension and contingent particulars. So although one may go to a lecture in physics and the physicists may tell us the story of Isaac Newton and the apple, we know it's only to get his audience interested. Whether such an event actually took place doesn't make the slightest difference to the science of gravity, which could proceed untroubled, even if it turned out that Isaac Newton was not the great originator he's always been taken for. But for the historian of 17th century science, it's a very different matter. The occurrence of particular discoveries, their impact on society, the way they were communicated among other investigators. This is probably of much greater importance to the historian of science than whether the evidence actually warranted the conclusions drawn from it at the time, or whether the theorization was sophisticated enough for our present state of knowledge, and so on. So here we have, as it were, two foci in the pursuit of knowledge. We can make the distinction between them clearer, I think, by focusing on the role played in each by time. The object of a natural science is to achieve some form of conceptual formulation that could be abstracted from all its temporal conditions. A formulation sufficiently generic to be indifferent to historical change. So, if one day we all woke up and found that apples had stopped falling downwards and started leaping off the ground to land on trees, we know that the physicists would confidently start advancing their suggestions about why they used to fall up until yesterday and have now started to fly up from today, all the time trying to formulate a descriptive schema that would be valid both before and after this mysterious change, proving, therefore, that the change was not radical, but could be accommodated in a broader scheme that allows for these conditions and those conditions which make apples behave in opposite ways. Excuse the banality of my illustration. You don't expect me to talk serious science, I know. But that's, as it were, the goal, to get such a description. And that's what we mean by saying that these sciences study nature, which is literally the way things are at birth, before anything happens to them. That's what our nature philologically is. If there remain in explanatory schemas of the natural sciences elements of randomness, and it is, of course, for physicists, not for people like me, to say whether or to what extent that is the case, it still needs to be that the conditions of those random events can themselves be determined and described. In such and such conditions, either this or that may equally follow, and so on. Thus, the randomness is not allowed to be foundational either. But the historical sciences aim in exactly the opposite direction. They aim to rest in the narrative tension. They do not look for universal rules that will encompass every phenomenon. They look for a narrative that will make the sequence of events as we know of it wholly intelligible. And this presumes, of course, regularities that contribute to intelligibility. But it does not terminate in those regularities. It terminates in a sequence which is ultimately both unique and intelligible on its own terms. David Hume thought that he could turn the study of history into a search for universal rules. Everything that happened was either an experimental demonstration of a natural law or was simply a random exception. Well, not surprisingly, he ended up with so many random exceptions that the rules he was supposing to be demonstrating ended up pretty vacuous and uninteresting at the end. History cannot be pushed into that shape. Its proper form is a connected and coherent account of unique happenings in a world of regular relations. We often make Hume's mistake just commonplace way ourselves. We're fond of inventing pseudo-rules to persuade ourselves that we're not surprised when something really very surprising has happened. Of course, we should have seen it coming is the first reaction of all wiseacres, as though they possessed a science that, had they been attentive enough, would have allowed them to predict exactly whatever it is that has just broken on the world. Well, there is no such science, period. Or if there is, nobody has yet demonstrated it. There are different kinds of explanation, and all events have their explanations. 25 years ago, the Islamist attacks on New York and Washington, that example shocked the world. These attacks can be intelligibly narrated. The motivations and preparations of Osama bin Laden and his collaborators can be explained and accounted for. But there's no imaginable point of view in the world from which they could have been predicted. No event of history is nothing but the operation of a universal rule. When we are told that God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good, we're told of something that God did over and beyond the sheer making of things. He reflected on his work. He comprehended it. He valued it. There is this further rationality of reflection and appraisal, a rationality of the seventh day of creation. In one sense, creation was finished on the sixth day, when it received its finishing touches, man and woman. But its true completion is the moment of its comprehension, when God looks at it. A bad theological practice has sometimes encouraged us to think of creation as incomplete. It's not incomplete. It is a totality, an intelligible whole, a perfection of reason in itself that we aspire to understand. Yet precisely because it is so, it opens the way to new initiatives of divine achievement, something on a different plane, in which the perfection of being is opened up to a perfection of reflection and knowledge. So from one aspect, the Sabbath is a decisive conclusion. From another, it is the promise of something still to be accomplished. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, says the authors of the Hebrews again. Here begins, you might say, the life of the mind of mankind, a cognitive and practical life of praise for the Creator and his work, which must be brought to completion. Three very quick conclusions and a close. First, we can see why this further dimension of reason may be called the humanities. Not because among the multitude of kinds that God has made, mankind is the only important one, or even the most important one, but because in making the universe, God has made mankind a partner in care and knowledge of his handiwork, and summoned us to that role. Secondly, because that role is one we do not simply have, but are summoned to fill, we can see why this further dimension may be called practical. It's a knowledge of the specific good of being human, in the end, and of how we're to realize it. Something that tends to be forgotten, I'm afraid, in some ideas of the human sciences. And thirdly, because this knowledge has to be formed in the midst of God's unfolding work in bringing creation to its completion, our experience of time is transformed. We can see why it is necessarily, in a broad sense, an area of historical knowledge. History is time shaped to its goal, narratable, intelligible from the point of view of its completion. And when time appears to us no longer simply as a space, a kind of fourth dimension within which things occur, but appears to us as the revelation of God's purposes, then time becomes history. We do not yet see everything subject to him, but we see Jesus, humbled for a while below the angels in his mortal suffering, and crowned with glory and honor. Amen.